Welcome to Taxpayer Empowerment. I'm Jose Melendez, Campaign Director for the Taxpayer Protection Project at the Texas Public Policy Foundation. Taxpayers deserve transparency, accountability, and responsible government at every level, especially at the local level, where many of the decisions directly impact our daily lives. Today we're joined by Martinez de Vara, Mayor of Ormy, Texas, attorney and longtime advocate for responsible government and steward of taxpayer dollars. Mayor Martinez de Vara, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Jose.
Excellent. Well, why don't we get started? Let's jump right in. So you've spent years working in the public policy and law space, but in addition to that, you've chosen to serve the citizens directly in local government. So speak to that a little bit. What motivated you to step into that role of being mayor, and why do you think that's, let's put it this way, the front line or standing at the front line for citizens and protecting them and protecting their tax dollars?
Yeah, so my path into local government was kind of unplanned, unexpected. I was attending law school at St. Mary's in San Antonio. I had moved out to my grandmother's farm out in Ormy, and I joined the volunteer fire department, mainly because there was not a lot to do. And we would get these regular rains, and we had a part of the highway that would flood so regularly that we would stage. And the fire chief would make us go out and wait for cars to drive through. And I remember just one day saying, like, well, why doesn't somebody fix this? Like, this is obviously a problem. And everyone throws their hands up. The county judge won't do anything. The mayor doesn't want to do anything. And then one day I just blurted out, well, why don't we form a city and do it ourselves? And if you know anything about firefighters, they have multi-day conversations. And eventually the chief said, hey, Art, you're in law school. Why don't you figure out how we form a city? When your fire chief gives you an order, you do it. So we went out. We learned about the law. We realized that we were within the extraterritorial jurisdiction of San Antonio, so we couldn't just form a city ourselves. And then we spent the next 2 or 3 years basically fighting with the city of San Antonio. Ultimately, we prevailed, formed the city, and we're able to address issues now on our own. Now, that's a very unique situation, right? Most people become mayors of an existing city. Sometimes cities have been around for 100 years, right?
It's not every day that a law student thinks to themselves, I want to start a city.
Right. Yeah. I remember asking my professor, hey, how do we start a city? And he was like, I don't know. Let's figure it out. Let's look it up. It doesn't happen very often, right? When I was elected mayor, I was the very first mayor, and I didn't inherit any budgets or debt or staff. And it like I said, unexpected, but it allowed us to do what most people do as a thought experiment. If I were to restart my city, how would I do it? And so I remember our county commissioner gave us advice of, hey, go get $1 million bond, build a city hall, buy some police vehicles, and get going. But that didn't make sense because that's not what I did in my personal life, right? Like a lot of college kids, I had gotten into credit card debt. I had finally paid it off, and I'm like, I don't want to, these are my neighbors. Some of them are my family members. We're not just going to go throw a bunch of debt on people. And so we just started the process of doing things the way we felt just naturally, should be done in the most responsible way, right? Because we were the caretakers of our neighbors' money, and so we avoided debt. We did start out with a property tax. We didn't know what to do, so we just picked the average property tax in the county. But over the next 6 years, we progressively lowered it, and we're able to eliminate it. People started taking notice, and we've had other cities like City of San Diego, City of Kingsbury that formed and try to follow that model. And eventually, it took more of a form as far as principles and things that we were trying to accomplish. But it really started organically, and it was bipartisan. I mean, our town was I remember at one point we had the Republican precinct chair and the Democrat precinct chair on the city council, and we were proposing another major tax cut, and we had a unanimous vote because property taxes comes out of everyone's individual budget. So however you view it, it's a real threat, especially in rural Texas, where a lot of people inherit their property or they've owned their property and they're on fixed incomes, and property tax really cuts into their prescription budget, their food budget, their household, their ability to maintain their property. And so it snowballed, if you will, and then eventually we were able to eliminate it. one of the things we learned early on, again, as a very small suburban city, is since we didn't control our utilities, San Antonio controls the electric and the water in that area, we weren't able to incentivize economic development. And so we ended up abandoning that as a tool and instead using the tax code, because San Antonio could say, hey, come into our town, we're going to run a free water line, or we're going to charge you half for sewer. And we couldn't do that. So we started offering, pass-through fees for permitting. So if the inspector charges the city $150, your permit fee is $150. We don't stack it. We promised no property taxes, right? If you brought in sales tax producing businesses, and using that model, our initial budget was just minuscule. It was like $80,000 for the year, our very first year, because we had no sales or property tax. And today it's like 1.2 million. So we've drastically been able to increase consumption taxes by using our development code to make it cheaper and faster and easier to build in our community. And it's been working as a model.
Certainly a unique pathway to becoming mayor. For a moment, I mentioned at the top that in addition to being mayor, you're an attorney.
Sure.
So let's switch gears for just a moment. You're currently involved in a legal case involving the city of Dallas and Proposition U, which passed in 2024. So for listeners who haven't necessarily followed the case, tell us for a moment just the basics. What's Proposition U, and what did this proposition seek to do? Why did Dallas voters approve it?
Sure. So a community organization named Dallas Hero proposed 3 ballot amendments to address the issues of crime and homelessness, quality of life issues in the city of Dallas. The voters approved 2 of them. Prop U deals with the law enforcement. It would require the city to increase its police force based upon an ordinance that it had establishing a resident to officer ratio, which they repealed after this was passed. But they had roughly 3,000 officers, and they needed to be around 4,000 officers. It also requires them to catch up on their pension fund, which is years behind, and to raise the minimum salary to be in the top 5 in the region to address recruitment and retention issues. The other measure they passed was Prop S, which was a waiver of sovereign immunity, allowing citizens to sue when the city is not following federal, state, or local law. So if they're not following their own laws, it gave citizens standing. And those combination of those 2 is what we're utilizing in the lawsuit. Essentially, the voters, through the process of direct legislative authority, which is allowed. Cities often say, "Hey, we're sovereign. We're a home rule city. We have a city charter." But great minds who set that up also realized that there needed to be a release valve, and that is, initiative and referendum, where the citizens can directly legislate when the council is not being responsive, and that's what happened here. So the citizens approved it, required it, essentially, year over year, 50% of the general revenue that comes in and above the previous year, 50% of that has to go to these law enforcement improvement goals until they're satisfied. And the city hasn't done that. And so we've filed this litigation along with the Texas Attorney General, Ken Paxton. AG's office is representing the state of Texas. We're representing 2 private plaintiffs. One of which, they're very compelling stories. If you go on the Dallas Hero website, there's little videos showing their background. But in one scenario, a gentleman's child was hit by a drunk driver while he was riding his bike on the bicycle, and Dallas PD took 5.5 hours to respond due to personnel shortages. Right? And this is a top tier, call to respond to a child hit by a drunk driver. Others, just having homeless encampments on their property in front of their door, people just constantly violating, being unable to address those issues. And so, the voters require this of the city. They clearly, wanted to establish these budget priorities, and the city's just not complying with it.
There's a few core things that citizens come to expect with their cities, and I think public safety is definitely one.
Absolutely.
Picking up the trash, things of that nature.
Absolutely.
Broadly speaking, can you touch on just the importance of this case when we think about holding our local governments accountable to keeping true to their word or the mandates of voters?
Right. It is on several levels. One of the challenges when you sue government for any reason is they have a large number of immunities. They have sovereign immunities, they have official immunities, and there's reasons for that. But cities, especially city attorneys, often hide behind those immunities to protect bad acts of the city councils. And so, for example, you cannot sue your local city unless you were individually the harm was individualized, that you're harmed in a different way than everyone else. So if the city harms everybody equally, you don't have any standing to sue. Only the Attorney General's office can sue. And there's only so many cases the Attorney General's office can handle statewide. And so one of the unique things about the Prop S and U is the waiver of sovereign immunity to allow individual citizens to sue the city directly to force them to comply with state, federal, or local law. And so in one aspect, what's interesting about this case is the ability of the citizens to do that has been challenged by the city. They claim it's unconstitutional, that it violates the rights of the city, which to me makes no sense because the city, if anything, is just a representative of the citizens who enacted this waiver, right? So it's a very circular argument. It's somehow putting the middle tier, if you look at any city's org chart, sometimes it's hyperbole. They always put the citizens at the top, then the mayor and the council, and then the various staff positions. So that I think is going to be adjudicated whether or not the citizens have the right to waive their city's immunity so that average citizens can sue for compliance with state and federal law. Additionally, I think you see not only in Dallas but in other communities a lot of frustration at the tendency for some urban cities to be shying away from law enforcement. Essentially the defund the police movement. 3 or 4 years down the road, now that these real effects are happening, you still see the policymakers turning the other way and trying to just ignore the problem or pretending like it isn't there. I mean, when you go from 4,000 officers to 3 and crime, accelerates, you might want to wake up and realize that there's a reason there, right? And should police need reforming, you can do all that, but simply defunding the police was an absurd idea, and residents are speaking out. And so I think it's really important for those two scenarios. One is to really highlight the need to reverse some of these anti-law enforcement policies that we see across the state, and two, to have the Supreme Court uphold citizens' right to directly legislate in home rule cities, and to essentially veto city council when that causes. And it's not an easy thing to do. So it's not like this can happen willy-nilly. It really takes a crisis within the community for residents to pay up enough attention, circulate petitions, hold an election. I mean, the city of Dallas spent roughly $3 million in opposition to these propositions against regular citizens, and still they prevailed. So it's about as clear as a mandate,
sure,
I think, that there can be.
So just one more question on this subject. From your perspective, when you think about public safety spending, how do you prioritize that kind of spending versus spending on other governmental items?
Right. I think, as a budget writer or as a member of a council, you have to start by listing your priorities and quantifying them, right? Some communities do a citizen to officer ratio to say, hey, we want to make sure we have this amount of enforcement. Others look at trends in crime statistics and say, hey, if we have a surge in property crimes, we need to focus on those areas. And so there's different methods of doing it, but certainly just blanket defunding doesn't work. But you start by identifying the public policy goals and ranking them, and then applying the dollars there. And unfortunately, you can never fund everything you want, obviously, and so you have to take those priorities. But you certainly need to prioritize it, and that's what the citizens. I mean, as a mayor, some of the worst crises you could have is, again, a law enforcement crisis, but not picking up the trash, things like that. Very earthy things, right? Potholes, those sorts of things is what people expect. And we don't hear anything, and when nobody shows up to your meetings, you're doing a great job, but it's expected. So yeah, you certainly have to do it by prioritizing and ranking your public policy goals in each budget. I think a tendency for a lot of people have is to simply carry over the prior year's budget and either adjusting, hey, we have more revenue, so we're just going to sprinkle it here or there, or proportional. And the problem with that is the budget priorities that created prior budgets get calcified and just carried forward without rationally thinking, well, what was the policy behind that? And has that been addressed already? Is that still the correct priority level? And a lot of people don't like to take the time to do it. It's exhaustive.
So another subject that's top of mind for many Texans is property taxes. Continues to be a financial stress on the state. So from your perspective, a very simple question: what's the biggest reason for our rising property tax bills? I say simple question.
I know. Yeah, I was thinking
it's simple to ask, but I'm sure the answer is more complex.
Yeah. I would say the greatest reason is essentially home price inflation. Coupled on top of our system of appraisals is causing dramatic increase in property taxation. And the fact that we use that methodology to assess taxation and not, public need, if you will, I think now we're seeing a disconnect because of the rates of inflation, right? Are unprecedented, at least for the last couple of decades, and are being highly reflective. I give you an example. In my community, again, we're rural. We have a lot of manufactured housing. Typically, manufactured housing depreciated, kind of like a RV or a vehicle. You buy it, and then every year it simply goes down. Well, in the last 2 or 3 years in Bexar County, manufactured housing has been the highest appreciating asset class, above commercial, above retail, above single-family homes, and so we've seen, that trickle down, into, for example, manufactured housing communities who own their homes have had to have great, increases in rent prices because of that. And again, taxing people based upon the value of their home isn't a one-to-one comparison to what does the local governmental entity need to operate or function or to achieve the public policy goals and the needs of the community. And so we're seeing a big disconnect, and I think it's causing a lot of people to revisit how we tax, why we tax it that way. I think if you look back historically, our current system is kind of based on our 1876 Constitution. And in 1867, we're a very agrarian state. It's pre-computer and electronic era, so it's very complicated to tax things by other methods. And so taxing land value seemed to have been a very logical, broad-based way of taxing wealth and production within the state. But then you fast forward 150 years, and the question remains: is that really the same way? And then of course, 150 years of lobbying and special interests. There's hundreds of different classes of taxpayers, right? From ag users to exempt veterans to so everyone's getting carve-outs, and it's this Swiss cheese. We don't have a single tax for all people. Again, it highlights the vulnerabilities more and more as we progress. On an interesting note, one of the ways we were able to achieve a zero tax rate in Ormy was by refusing to give any exemptions. Again, as a new city, people came and they wanted the various exemptions that most cities have, and we opened it up to this big public discussion. And one of the points that I made was, hey, if we exempt certain people from taxation, then what incentive do they have to keep us in check, right? And so why don't we have no exemptions? And so if you're over 65 and you have your valid reason, and you're a disabled veteran, you definitely have your valid reason. If you're a young couple with children, you have your valid reason, so forth and so on. You're just a single young person trying to get ahead in life. We all have the same interest, and that'll bring the tax rates down. and it was successful. So I'm certainly not a fan of having tax exemptions and carve outs and different rates for different people. If everyone were in the same bucket, I think you would see more pressure into driving tax rates down.
So staying in the tax space, a lot of times you'll hear cities say, we're lowering your tax rate, but yet citizens are looking at their tax bills and they continue going up. Can you take a moment and just explain the difference between what is the tax rate and then what is it that folks are feeling when they see tax bills are going up?
Great. Yeah, so the tax rate is the percentage of your value, your assessed value that you pay in tax. And so the appraisal district comes in and it's certainly more of an art than a science. And as an attorney, I've done several, we do valuation protests every year. So if your valuation increases at a faster pace, your elected officials can impose the same rate, but they're going to collect more in tax. And I mean, it's a great system for non-accountability, right? Because as an elected official, you can tell people, I didn't raise your rates. We kept them the same, or we lowered your rates. Yet
it's great messaging. When I hear that kind of messaging, it also makes me think of other messaging that works really great, especially when it comes to bonds. It's for the children.
Yes.
When I hear officials say we're lowering the tax rate, I'm basically hearing the same thing. It has the same tune.
Right. And there's no direct accountability. Now the legislature recently added a taxpayer advocate to be elected to the appraisal board. But before that, the appraisal boards were, and they still are, the vast majority of each appraisal board is elected by the taxing jurisdictions, right? So the taxing jurisdiction, of course, has every interest in ensuring that the appraisal board keeps appraisals higher so that they can politically maintain or lower tax rates. And I think to the average, resident who's just busy living their life, raising their family, it's a little bit of a kind of a genie in the box. But you're right. At the end of the day, they get a higher tax bill, and the person you would logically go to is your mayor and council and say, "Well, why am I paying more?" Or my school board, and they're able to say, "Well, we didn't raise your tax rates." And so I think we need greater transparency. And again, I think because of we need to revisit this appraisal system as a means or method of assessing taxation.
So one item that I think is very closely related to this property tax talk is the amount of local government spending, whether it's your counties, your cities, your school districts. What disciplines out there do you think local governments need to hold to in terms of budgeting and spending in order to create a better tax environment?
A lot of people spend what they collect. Sometimes you feel as if their methodology is, what is our bonding capacity? You often hear people promote bonds where they say, well, there's no new tax. We're not taxing you, simply because older bonds are maturing and falling off. They see that additional taxing capacity as a way to just reborrow. We tried several things in Vaughn Ormy. We start with, the zero-based budgeting. It's much easier to do in a small city, and start with what do we need and with what priority. Okay, we need 5 police officers. We need to purchase a vehicle. We need fire protection. Budget, your spending and your receivables are two sides of the same coin, right? People often view them as separate. So we like to start with what do we need? How much is that going to cost? And then you get to, well, how are we going to find the funds? And taxation should be the last priority. If you can get it through enterprise revenue, the city operates a concert hall or whatever and brings in revenue. Those are ways to offset franchise fees, other things that you can do. And then also, what's the most equitable way of paying for it, right? Is it property taxation? Is it sales tax? Is it, any other? There's a wide variety of taxation available to cities, hotel occupancy taxes, so forth and so on. Grants, federal expenditures or whatnot. But people typically just copy the previous budget, adjust from that. A lot of cities also get entangled with long-term obligations, and so you don't have that flexibility. You inherit decisions made from prior councils. There's civil service contracts, things like that. And so oftentimes in a mature city, 50, 60, 70, 80% of the budget's already pre-spent, right? And so you're working with a very little wiggle room as what are you able to prioritize. And so having long-term goals about not tying the hands of future councils, I think are wise decisions, right? But people often want to get their project in or what they want to accomplish now and tie in future councils, right? Because of the normal political back and forth. They're like, well, maybe in 5 years, the political winds will shift and they'll cancel my project or the way I view things. And so cities tend to lock their future councils in based upon their decisions. And so maybe some type of legislative reform that prevents that or puts windows on how far in the future you can tie councils, because things change. Political opinions change, realities on the ground change. I mean, 20 years ago when we started Von Ormy, we were very rural. There was farmland between us and San Antonio, and that's not there anymore, right? Now we're suburbanized. 20 years in the future, we may be an urban center, right? And so tying the future, councils into a rural policy decision for the next 20, 25 years isn't often the wisest thing to do. And so making more micro decisions is a good rule of thumb. But honestly, for most people, and the way I see most municipal officials view themselves or their role, it's to tie the city into those decisions long term, and so I don't see that happening. Though that's how I would like it to be seen. Yes.
Excellent. As we wrap up our conversation, I do want to touch on a concept that has been associated with Von Ormy. So the concept of a Liberty City, where government is small, taxes are low, and spending is minimal. Right. Talk to us about what the original vision for a Liberty City was and how that has why that maybe translate into Von Ormy being the city that it is today.
Sure. Well, just like our tax policy, it originated kind of organically. Mm-hmm. It wasn't that we sat down and said, let's do this. Okay. Let's form a Liberty City. It had a lot to do with, us being able to live out what most people have as a thought experiment, mm-hmm. right? How would we want our city to be organized? And so, yes, so our property tax policy was a key part of it, got a lot of attention. The fact that we were reducing property taxes and substituting them with sales and consumption taxes as we were able to increase those through a minimized development code, being kind of pro-development in those sorts of ways. But it also involved protection of individual rights, right? I'll give you an example. We had a council member bring up a nighttime curfew. Every other city in Bexar County had a nighttime curfew. That was the argument. We should have one too. And again, we used to have a lot of these meetings, community meetings, and I invited all the kids from our local high school in and went over the historic, problems with restricting people's right to travel, right? One, it's a constitutional right to travel. Mm-hmm. It was the basis of the slave codes. It was the basis of Jim Crow, right? We're a 95% Hispanic community, right? Mm-hmm. And argued, why should we as a city council prejudge our youth to be up to no good if they're out after 10 p.m.? Now, certainly we told everybody, hey, if you're committing graffiti, creating mischief, you're going to get caught and we're going to prosecute you. Mm-hmm. But that doesn't mean we need to restrict people's rights to travel preemptively, right? And it got voted down unanimously after that conversation. So we're the only city without a nighttime curfew. 20 years later, I don't see us any different than the other city as far as, youth delinquency or whatnot. And so continue to do that. We instilled no additional gun restrictions outside of the state. A lot of cities banned that. We never banned fireworks. One of my first, my first crises as mayor was I was elected in November. Mm-hmm. That fireworks season, our county judge banned fireworks across Bexar County, and we're one exit away from the neighboring county who hadn't banned them. So I get the call, hey, mayor, we need to ban fireworks. The whole county's doing it. Are you on board? well, why should I put my business out of, my folks out of business when all people have to do is drive one more exit and they can buy all the fireworks they want?
Right.
Well, he's like, I'm going to send out the news crew. So we had helicopters flying. I was actually out of town for the holidays and getting calls. Everyone's nervous. And, I was able to tell the local TV stations, well, if you want to buy fireworks, come to Port. We're open. Everybody knows it. And so, things like that, I think, resonated with people elsewhere around the state. We had a incorporation effort website, and we just left it up in case anybody else wanted to figure out how to do it, because it took a lot of work and effort for us to figure it out ourselves. And then, so people started contacting us. First was, I believe, Sandy Oaks, Texas, and Kingsbury. And, Kingsbury, I would say, is the first Liberty city that started that way and have maintained from day one. They've never had a property tax. They've maintained, the highest level of, individual property rights of any city that I know of. And they're doing strong and well, I think they're over 10 years in existence now. And so it's really that combination of having having fiscal restraint. As I had mentioned earlier, our commissioner asked us, hey, go borrow $1 million and build a city hall. Instead, we utilized a double wide trailer, right? Nobody knew the difference. Nobody cared. In fact, and we were a small enough city where, hey, if you needed a permit, we'll just go hand deliver it to you, right? We set a policy of we had no fees for residents. So yes, you need a building permit, but it doesn't have a cost, things like that. And it just, my thought was, what kind of a city would I like to live in? I don't like paying fees. I don't like paying property taxes. I don't like when the government comes in and restricts you or regulates you unnecessarily. And so we just decided we're not going to go that way. And it resonated. And now looking back, yes, we give it names and we give it structure and we can kind of identify the principles, but it was really kind of magical to live through to see residents. One of the advantages we have is we had no political culture at the time. Like there wasn't this faction or that faction or Republican, Democrat, or like a lot of cities have. They have groups, the Chamber of Commerce has their group and this group. We didn't have that. We were a bunch of greeny new people and simply asking that question. What should government look like now that we've been able to achieve one for our own? It's something I wish most communities could go through, or I don't know, maybe they could reboot some of these large cities and let the residents come in and say, hey, if we start from scratch, how do we want this to operate? And it's generally not going to be what most people experience at their local city level.
On that, you said other communities. When you think of other cities in Texas who might be looking at the Liberty City model, what are the biggest takeaways that you think they should go away with in order to keep government more lean?
One is look at, what is the difference between essential and what people just commonly do, right? Is it essential to have a brick and mortar nice city hall? It wasn't for us, right? We could have gone out and got into a lot of debt for police vehicles. We found, we would buy them on auctions and pay cash as we went, avoiding the debt. So, I think the main thing is to realize that you can reduce and or eliminate property taxes, though it takes long-term planning. It took us, I think, 6 years to do it. You need to focus on generating other sources of revenue. In our case, it was sales taxes. We happen to be on a corridor. We're on I-35. And so we knew that the more corridor businesses we had, the more people even from outside of our community would contribute. But they come through our cities, and when they occasionally have a car stalls out or there's a traffic accident, we do respond. And so, spreading the tax burden as broad and wide as possible lowers the burden proportionally on everybody, right? Instead of concentrating it in a few areas and having people push and pull and lobby for, I don't want to be that guy. I don't want to be the one with the target on my head. Let's point it at somebody else. It's effective. And just looking for cost savings and budgeting based upon priorities of today, I think are the main focuses. And you have to be very creative. There's no, say, cookie cutter to say, we're a small community in rural Bexar County, rapidly urbanizing. That's going to be a very different, tactical approach than, say, a large city that's been around for 100 years and has a large amount of debt, right? you probably want to start attacking your city's debt burden so that you can actually spend more of your annual budget. Right? If half of your budget's going to debt service, you're really only operating on the other half. And so one of the things we would do is we would break down our budget based upon what percentage of dollars is actually going to the delivery of services today versus administrative overhead, debt. We did have debt first. We bought a city park and had a short little note on that. Maintenance, those kinds of costs. And when you look at lots of local governments, what you'll see is it's really out of whack, right? Or you see trends, right? I know you see that a lot in our local school districts. We did a study a few years back where we looked at it, and even though the inflation-adjusted amount of dollars towards education was higher, the vast majority of that was going into administrative overhead. So it's not going into the classroom. So really tracking, your dollars and making sure that you've maximized the number of dollars for the delivery of services and minimizing all the other overheads as much as possible. It's a great strategy to begin with, but requires a lot of analysis to be able to do it.
So, as a final question, before we sign off, when you think about your position as mayor, you have other mayors out there who are starting in their positions, other council members. Let's say they come to you and they ask, Art, how can I, govern responsibly while still meeting the needs of a growing community? Mm-hmm. What would you tell them? What would your advice be to those folks?
I would always start with the residents themselves.
Mm-hmm.
The first thing we did when we started Von Ormy was created a series of studies of what the residents to find out what were their priorities.
Mm-hmm. And
we were surprised that some of them were not the same as what the first councils assumed their priorities were, right? So to making a meaningful effort first to find out what your citizens are expecting of you and want of you, and then that's your playbook, right? That's your mandate. That's your and that goes above and beyond. I was elected, so I'm the king, kind of thing. My policy is what everybody wants. Really try, but taking that effort, then guide your public policy, and then again, you doing your best to maximize those dollars towards those priorities. Having them ranked in order, and then minimizing your overhead and your long-term obligations from stale or expired priorities that you're still entangled with.
Excellent. Yeah. Well, Mayor, thank you so much for joining us today, and thank you for your leadership.
Thank you.
Until next time, I'm Jose Melendez reminding you it's your money, your voice, and your government.